Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony today. I would like to go back to an earlier discussion regarding the transition of the clerk of courts and prothonotaries, if only to talk more about clerks of courts and prothonotaries. Many of them are doing great work. I had the privilege of serving as an elected clerk of courts, and so very interested in this topic of discussion. Representative Grove was asking a number of questions about the constitutional implications of transitioning these constitutional officers from having been elected to now being appointed. He was asking the constitutional implications. If I could ask of the philosophical thought behind that. And I come in with grave concerns, but also open-minded. I'm willing to be convinced that I'm wrong. Can you explain, do you believe there is a role, or evidently not a role, for an independent, autonomous, elected clerk of courts or prothonotary? I'm sure the governor, if he had the ability, would rather see some constitutional office holders be appointed rather than elected. In this instance, do you not believe there's a role for an independent, elected clerk of courts or prothonotary?
No. What I've had a very difficult time trying to understand is how a 19th century apparatus fits into our current needs. Bottom line is that prothonotaries and clerk of courts serve the court system. They're part of the judicial family. And I think it's very important from a management point of view that they be fully integrated into the judicial system. One of our very important experiences was about 6-7 years ago when we tried to implement the automation system, the criminal case management system for the entire Commonwealth. It was at that point how we realized how pivotal clerks of courts were to the judiciary, and it was at that time that I think we forged a more closely working relationship with the Clerks and the Prothonotaries Association. I think that sometimes clerks and prothonotaries are undervalued. And I think that if you were to ask your members, your clerks and prothonotaries, about what their preferences would be, certainly job security is an important factor. But in my discussions with them, their so-called independence has not been a factor that has been important with regard to this initiative. I think that there will be nothing sacrificed with regard to bringing those people who are responsible for our court records into the judicial family. It's a term that's used often, but I don't think it really promotes any meaningful result.
Let me ask you this, but you were a clerk. What's your view?
My view is I did feel that having standing, just like a member of the Court of Common Pleas, that I was elected by the people and that I was accountable for the service that I provide, the records that I maintain, that I was accountable to the electorate, and therefore had some independent standing, that I was on equal footing, having been elected by the members, by the residents of Lancaster County, just as a member of the Court of Common Pleas. I think gave me a level of autonomy and independence, and I think made me more efficient and more effective as a clerk of courts. That is my personal view. And again, my concern is, and I understand the desire for a unified system, but as I sort of half-jokingly referred to, I'm sure the governor, with some of his constitutional elected executive branch officials, would have a more unified system of governance as well if they were appointed. So I understand that approach. I personally do have concern with that.
There's, I think, one other important factor, and I think it had been mentioned previously, and that is, I think that if you were to speak with the prothonotaries and clerks, One of the important benefits in being part of a unified judicial system is the support that they would get in terms of their daily operations. I've had a number of discussions with clerks and prothonotaries, and they struggle on a daily basis meeting their operational needs. It's very difficult with regard to our strapped county court systems to obtain the necessary resources in order to do their jobs effectively. They've had to, get paper from other sources and so forth. So I think that there are a lot of factors to take into consideration. The fact of independence, in my view, is not at the very top. There are other important, I think, factors that support an initiative that would bring the clerks and prothonotaries into our unified judicial system.
If I could ask just very quickly about the transition. As I understand it, clerks that are elected and terms expire at the conclusion of 2014 and the conclusion of 2016, they would remain the clerk of courts prothonotaries until a date to be determined. Do I understand those elected office holders, their terms would expire, they had been elected by the electorate, their terms expire, and do they then transition into continuing to serve but now in an appointed capacity?
Yes. I think the bottom line answer is yes.
And then who has higher fire authority at that? Presumably they are now employees
They
of
would
the
be county
court.
court employees. Ultimately, the supervision of the judicial district is up to the president judge. And so that would be the person who would be responsible for the administration of the clerks and prothonotaries who come into the system. The other thing that I want to mention to you is that as with the court administrators in 2000, one of our fundamental principles is to do no harm to those clerks and prothonotaries who serve the system. And so there is nothing in the initiative, for example, with regard to a prothonotary or clerk that is elected, that term of office would continue. And I think there's a provision there in the legislation or proposed legislation that would give the prothonotary or clerk the option of coming into the system.
Mm-hmm. And just final question. So some of the elected clerk of courts would have a salary that was set for their time of office. The salary structure would then be set by the courts under the new, as they transition to an appointed clerk of courts prothonotaries. Would some clerk of courts experience a salary reduction, and presumably some, I'm not sure if the salaries have been figured out or the salaries of the deputies, but I imagine some who have higher salaries as elected officials may experience a salary decrease, and others would see a salary increase?
As I mentioned, in 2000, there was a fundamental principle of do no harm. And when those court administrators were brought in, no one suffered a reduction in salary. So it is our anticipation that for those clerks and prothonotaries who were brought into the system, they would not suffer a reduction in salary.
Some may experience an increase, though.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.